Hello, and welcome to Nous, the podcast where we tackle the deepest questions about the mind. I'm your host, Ilan Goodman, and my guest today is a cognitive scientist and philosopher whose research area may surprise you. It's one of the more neglected topics in the study of the mind, the sense of smell. Historically, smell has been dismissed as a brutish sense, too subjectively variable and basic to be worth deep study. Vision has hogged the limelight. But it turns out that smell is conceptually and neuroscientifically stranger and more complex than vision. And it has a lot to teach us about the nature of perception itself. Now, just before we get going, a quick request. I make the podcast purely for the love of it, and so all I ask, if you do enjoy it, is that you take the time to leave a 5-star review, and maybe share it with a friend or two. Thanks. Dr. Ann-Sophie Barwich, welcome to Nous.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm quite excited.
Now, I mentioned that historically the sense of smell has been treated pretty badly. It's been treated with some condescension. You quote Charles Darwin, I think in the introduction to your book, saying the sense of smell is of extremely slight service to mankind. And I think Kant has something to say about it as well, something sort of a bit condescending. Why has it been regarded as being of so little interest and value?
I think that's an excellent question, precisely because it has so many different reasons for it. And one reason is that it seems to be such a brutish sensation. So smell is incredibly important to animals. And we see animals using it the whole time. And of course, especially during the Enlightenment, when man wanted to be something different, and there was the hierarchy of beings based on reason and rationality, and it's called enlightenment and not ensmellment for a reason, so to speak. Like vision is the cognitive sense, maybe audition because there's human speech, but touch, taste, smell, all this is almost too animalistic. But that's just one reason. That's why the humanities basically neglected it. The other reason is it's incredibly hard to study. So the scientists also weren't very interested in it for a long time, because how do you measure smell? How do you make it comparable? How do you turn it into something objective? So there seems to be the issue of too much like the animals, and we like to be somehow different from that, which only recently has luckily changed. And then on the other hand, it seems to be so subjective, so hard to study. It's hard to capture.
I love that point about the Enlightenment, and it's in the metaphor that this vision is in that very metaphor, and our reliance on that as a kind of the primary sense and the most exalted sense, I guess. Now, your overall trajectory in the book is looking at why olfaction, so the sense of smell, challenges current conceptual foundations of neuroscience, which are based on the visual paradigm. Now, we're going to get there, but let's perhaps lay a little bit of groundwork before we try and tackle the really big ideas. Can you just give us a whistle-stop tour of the machinery of the sense of smell, the headlines of what bits do what and how it's achieved?
So the nice thing with smell is that it looks incredibly simple. So this is a feature that has been highlighted by none other than Ramon y Cajal, who already at the turn of the 20th century said, smell would be an amazing model system because it's so simple. So what you have is basically 3 steps, like 3 shallow steps with 2 synapses from the ear to the core of the cortex. So in comparison, like with vision, 2 synapses don't even get you out of the retina. And here you get the external signal and its representation in the brain in 2 steps, basically, and 2 mediated through 2 synapses. And what happens is, what most people know, okay, there are chemicals in the air, volatiles, which we're smelling, and they interact with the receptors, which are situated in the sensory neurons in the epithelium. And that signal is then projected towards the bulb, which is at the frontal lobe of the brain, right at the front of your brain.
Okay, so let's just be clear. The epithelium, it's a bit like the retina of the olfactory system, right?
Precisely. It's comparable to the retina when it comes to it's the first step. It's organized different than the retina, and we can come back to that later, of course. But this is where the first interaction happens, where basically chemical information is translated into electrical signals for the brain. And that's then forwarded to the brain. And what is interesting here is that from the bulb, where these signals are collected in a really nice fashion, is then sent further to the cortex, the olfactory cortex. And there's one particular part, the largest part, which is called the piriform cortex. It's called so because it really looks like a piriform if you look at these images. And so it looks simple, like three steps: epithelium, bulb, cortex. So what's the difficulty?
Okay, and what is the bulb? Is it just a sort of conglomeration of neurons, or is it?
So it's a neural structure at the frontal lobe, and there you've got you can imagine it almost like little pearls of string. It looks really like a little nice mosaic, and what's there, you've got small spherical structures where these sensory neurons are converging and form these kind of little, you could say, nests, these neural nests. And they're so important because this was the puzzle all along. So you have basically, when you've got this interaction at the epithelium, there is something that is actually incredible, because it's not that you have one molecule interacting with one receptor, but you have a combinatory explosion. So if you ask me, for instance, how many things can we smell when it comes to chemicals, there are estimates of like up to 1 trillion chemical stimuli, which is quite a number. And that's the reason why that is that when you've got a molecule hitting the epithelium, it interacts with different receptors. So you've got different receptors responding to the same molecule, but also to different parts of that molecule. And
so is it the shape? Is it the shape of the molecule that matters?
Yes and no. The shape, in terms of the stereochemistry, is one of the many features. So if you've got a chain molecule or you've got a cyclical compound, that matters. But that's not the only thing. So shape is relative in the sense that you can have, for instance, a chain molecule that within the receptors gets bent into a ring. So it's not just simply this molecule and this scent, but it's the interaction with the receptors. And then it depends, for instance, is there a specific atom group? So sulfur, for instance, is there a specific atom or atom group? Is there a certain flexibility to the molecule? How heavy is it? Is there any double bond? All this, there is about 5,000 different molecular parameters are involved in ligand binding, like in the binding between these molecules and the receptor. So the chemistry and the biological perception of that chemistry is mind-bogglingly complex. I mean, that's the first step, where it's different from vision, where, well, you've got with color vision, electromagnetic wavelength. This is a low-dimensional stimulus. You've got one key parameter. In olfaction, you've got 5,000. So this is where the complexity starts.
Well, let's just unpack that. So we're really clear, because it is fascinating. So molecules bind to receptors. Yeah. Okay, so that's, and then the receptors send off electrical signals. But the complexity arises, if I've understood you, from the shape of the molecules, and then the way that shape interacts with the shape of the receptors. And there are lots of different kinds of receptors. So there we've got all sorts of complexity already from lots of different molecules and different receptors, and then there's an interaction between the way they fit together.
So it's even like the size plays a role, whether you've got specific parts of the molecule, even just how heavy it sometimes is it hydrophobic, to what degree is it hydrophobic. So this is it's easy to say shape, but it's often getting misinterpreted that you've got this lock and key model still from the biology education. I'm often trying to get away from that, for the reason is that it gives the wrong picture. It's much more dynamic. It's much more processual. It's a nice metaphor, but one should not get hung up by that simplicity. But as you say, actually, there is so much going on here already, and it is the interaction between the receptors and the molecules that also change, for instance, the configuration, like the shape, especially if it's a more flexible molecule, what is actually detected. You're absolutely right. Yeah, this is where the complexity starts.
Yeah, good. Okay, so we've got a sense of the complexity already. I mean, I enjoyed this little dig at vision being one-dimensional or something. Would just explain that for me. Now, I mean, you're making a case that smell and olfaction is much more complex than it tends to have been given credit for. Explain that point about that you just made about the visual system being sort of one-dimensional.
I'm a bit mean here, so I'm a bit polemic. I should put this before I start why I said that. But I remember I was giving a talk about a year ago, and I had a vision researcher in the audience, and I was mocking vision a little bit, as I like to do. And he looked at me, he's like, well, you do know that color is a bit more complex. I was like, yes, And the nice thing is, the smell is even more complex. I'm making that point basically because usually smell has been always ridiculed for being kind of a primitive, simple sense. And the point is, no. This often covers up for the complexity of it. So when I say vision is simple, not at all. It's one of the most beautiful systems. It's structurally very complex. Even just the like how color system works, it's wonderfully complex. But compared to smell, it still looks very, very simple in a polemic sense. So with vision, you've got these, what I saw at the low dimensional stimulus. So you've got electromagnetic wavelength, where you've got different wavelengths. And what you have here is, you know, the pictures where you've got the color spectrum often. And the receptors, you've got three primary receptors, the green, red, and blue cones. And that basically, you could say almost divide this this kind of spectrum into different chunks. And all the other colors come how the brain computes then that. So there is actually no stimulus, for instance, no physical stimulus for pink. There is no pink wavelength. It's basically white light minus green. So it's a computational construction in your brain. But with smell, it's even much more complex because you don't have that continuity. And you've got 5,000 different parameters that are not linearly organized. So it's not like a piano. It's not like wavelength. You basically have a mosaic of different things that are thrown together in a way that, well, how would you even arrange that? And that's the puzzle that captures many olfactory researchers. Is there a physical stimulus space that can be carved up in such a way that it would respond to a perceptual space? So like wavelength with colors? Would there be anything like, okay, this feature means it's rose, or this kind of set of features means it's musk or pea or what have you? Well, to bring because smells they're good and they're bad smells and they're weird smells. But then also, how does the brain make sense of that? So we like to kind of think of the brain as being arranged into certain functions and certain spaces. But if you've got something of like 5,000 different parameters, how does the brain actually allocate neural space to that kind of informational complexity? With vision, it seems simpler or easier, even the computational construction, because it's additive. Like, as I said, pink, white light minus green light. So you can see how the brain might make sense of that in our understanding of computational processes. But with smell, it's like, well, what would that be? Is it like, okay, it's ketone minus that part is suddenly, no, that's not how it works. It's not that you've got basically the aldehyde next to the ketones or rose next to lavender.
So this question of how you organize the possible perceptual space of smell seems much more tricky than vision. So the visual system has three basic receptors in the retina. Do we have a number for the receptors, the olfactory receptors?
Oh yes, in humans about 400. So the number is slightly bigger, and it's this is where the complex. And then you must imagine these 400 receptors have. This is why it's such a combinatorial explosion. You detect more molecules in terms of more smells than there are atoms in the universe, actually. Even so, the combination is a complexity that's hard to imagine. You must imagine 400 different receptors detecting different parts of different molecules where there are 5,000 different parameters. So this is a big data problem for the brain.
Okay, that is mind-boggling. That is a huge space of possible smells, isn't it?
Oh yes, and
it's a terrifying concept.
It's cool. It explains why perfumery is working. If you imagine that we can smell things that have never existed in nature, so you've got synthetic chemistry where you can create molecules that are not existing in nature, so that haven't been part of a plant for a certain amount of evolutionary time. You can create something in the laboratory that came into existence literally in the last 5 minutes, and you can smell it immediately. You don't have to evolve new receptors. So you can smell all kinds of things as soon as they're there. And that's the beauty also of the olfactory system. It's so flexible to new things. You can't just suddenly perceive completely new colors because you're very, very set in what you can perceive. Olfaction lets you perceive things that haven't existed in nature yet. So it's possibly the only sensory system where you can create a stimulus and you can perceive a stimulus that has never existed in nature before.
Yes, you make this parallel in the book and earlier on in the book, and it got me thinking because it's sort of you go, gosh, there's no kind of new color that we could create so that you could suddenly go, I've never seen that color before. But you can create new smells, right? That's your point. I'm just wondering to what extent it's a fair comparison. If maybe the sort of the final percept, the sort of the unit of perception of the visual system isn't a color, it's a whole visual scene, it's a whole image. And if the final percept of the sense of smell is a complex sort of, a whole sensory scene, if you like, what's the point of comparison? It's the perceptual experience in smell it's just that smell is the end product, whereas with vision it's like an image, an overall image.
So you're absolutely right with that the comparison on the one hand a little bit unfair, but there is something about that unfairness which gives us a new understanding of both vision and olfaction actually. So you say, well, it would be unfair to say that it's just the color. Vision is much more complex. And you're right, and we perceive many, many new things. That is one thing. The other thing is that with smell, it's not just smell what we perceive. So it would be unfair also to smell to say, well, it's just the quality of smell we perceive. There's much more going on. There's much more going on when it comes to cross-modal sensations. So you're not just perceiving a smell, you're perceiving a smell in a certain environment in combination with the other senses. Many things you are picking up without necessarily perceiving them as smells. My favorite example is if you just go around, and especially if you're on a nice holiday, you do pick up certain things that are olfactory, but that are not necessarily registered as olfactory. Then you've got these kind of poetic expressions of something being kind of a stuffy environment, or something feels a little bit like stuffy in a way. And also there's a different way when it comes to what extent you actually are perceiving signals consciously or reacting to them, even though they're on a subconscious threshold. And smell is a good example here. With vision, you're constantly monitoring what's actually there. Well, like you can track a visual stimulus. You can just follow it with your gaze. With smell, they're literally popping in and out of consciousness. You don't seem to have any control over when something comes into your awareness and when it leaves. So there's a certain way in which it's kind of sitting at the background of consciousness. I like that expression, which I picked up from Barry Smith. He's like, yeah, it's kind of like in the background of, it's the backseat or background of consciousness. And I think this is a good way to explain why smell in and of itself is interesting, not just in comparison to vision, but that we also can learn a lot about vision here. To what extent is our understanding of vision just too much influenced by conscious awareness and conscious perception? I mean, there are now many visual researchers who say there's a much more interesting range of signals going on at the subconscious threshold, so maybe we should look more at that. I think I might sometimes be unfair to vision, but mainly in the sense that there's a limit to our visual theories that also restrict our understanding of vision. And this is where smell can help by looking at to what extent is this, sometimes in my case, polemic portrayal of vision unfair to vision. And why is it unfair? Well, because we actually overlook some things when we talk about it, but it becomes much clearer if you compare to smell and what things are actually not fitting between smell and vision that are actually different. And you could even say, what about all the other senses? Interoception, proprioception, all senses that have been neglected from philosophy as well.
Okay, fascinating. So that's a really interesting point about vision being in general much more consciously accessible than smell, and smell sitting in the back seat, in the background of consciousness a lot. And it seems to perhaps connect with the question I wanted to ask next, the topic I wanted to sort of ask you about next, which is that one of the features of smell that's made it seem so problematic is the idea that it's merely subjective, that it's very variable and context dependent, and it's not reliably telling us about objective features of the world. Can you explain a little bit more what that is all about?
Absolutely. So that is the thing that drove me mental actually for years. They say, but smell is so subjective, and how can we even describe it if not only do we perceive things differently, but even you yourself will have a different experience of a smell at different times. And I thought, well, there is a difference between subjectivity and variability. Smell is very there's a lot of variety in the way we perceive smell, but that doesn't mean it's subjective. Subjective means it's not connected to any objective cause, to any external cause. It's just a whim. But variability means that there is a cause and there is a cause for that variation. So I would like to often introduce the kind of Copernican shift or the paradigm shift to say, instead of measuring objectivity as we have to have the same mental image of the same physical stimulus, which is a very pre-scientific, rudimentary understanding of perception, and to do that kind of scientific approach, like what are the causal processes that are common to all people that A, explain how we come to perceive certain things, and B, that introduce that variety. And that is when we look at smell, been studied over the last couple of decades in particular, where lots of things where people thought it's just merely subjective or just a weird way in which people perceive things have very, very strong causal reasons, such as my favorite example is cilantro. So I like to do that with my students. Like, who of you actually likes cilantro and who of you doesn't? Because there's often a small percentage of people who hate cilantro. Instead of fresh and green, it's just soapy and sometimes a bit pungent. It's a genetic mutation near one of the olfactory receptor genes. So a lot of olfactory variation when it comes to why people dislike certain scents or perceive them even as a different quality is genetic variability. The olfactory system is one of the genetically most diverse systems. And this explains a lot of these kind of seemingly different things. And it breaks apart some interesting philosophical ideas as actually being totally misguided. So my favorite example is the idea that you've got this stimulus and you have to match it to a percept for some kind of naive understanding of representationalism or some naive understanding of physicalism. It's like, no, we have to approach it through biology. My favorite example here is androstenone, which is a pig pheromone, and humans can smell it. And the weird thing about that molecule is that some people find it pleasant. Some people find it unpleasant because it smells of urine. Well, not that great. Some people find it unpleasant because to them it smells of body odor. Also not pleasant. And some people find it pleasant because it has this woody smell. Like, hang on, what? And then you find people go like, oh yeah, it's super pleasant because it's kind of floral. It's like the same molecule having all these different qualitative categories associated with it. And the reason for that is, again, genetic variation. Sensitivity, it affects the sensitivity of the receptor. So it's not even that you've got one molecule having one smell. It can have a variety of smell depending on how the biology is tuned to picking up the information from that molecule.
Well, that's a lovely, clear example. There's also the issue of that. So that's kind of almost a bottom-up question, isn't it? It's the nature of the receptors, which are dependent on or influenced by genetic variation. But then there's the kind of psychological stuff. And I wanted to bring up one study that really struck me, I really enjoyed, from your book, which was the Rachel Hertz and Julia von Cleff study. So I'll just try and describe it, and then you can perhaps unpack what we might conclude from this and what the repercussions are. So they exposed participants to identical jars with a substance in them, which were identical, but they labelled them differently. So one example was they labelled vomit, and one they labelled Parmesan cheese. One was in reality what was in the jar was patchouli.
Oh no, butyric acid.
Yeah, so butyric acid was the vomit and the Parmesan cheese, right? And then the patchouli was labelled either musty basement or incense. Then they had pine oil as one of them. That was either labelled spray disinfectant or Christmas tree. Then they had menthol, and that was labelled either breath mint or chest medicine. And then the final one, violet leaf, which they either labelled fresh cucumber or mildew. There's a really nice contrast there. And what they found was that the large majority, 83%, believed that the odour in each pair was different because of, as a function of its label. So they have I understood this correctly, that each participant smelled both things, and they were saying one was a totally different thing.
So people were adamant that these were different smells, indeed. And they even gave them different hedonic in terms of, this is more pleasant, this is less pleasant preferences. And what I found so interesting here is that this might look like some visual illusion. So the rabbit duck thing, it's not quite the same. So yes, there's some kind of image shift going on, but what is much more interesting is that in this case, it looks like something. Oh, see, smell is subjective because clearly people can be fooled by the labels. Now, what's really going on is that your nose is incredibly accurate because butyric acid in the parmesan vomit, which is just my favorite example, case, it is butyric acid is part of both parmesan and vomit. It's just we're never smelling individual molecules, we're having always molecules in context. And the same molecule can be parts of a variety of different contexts. So you pick up the information always with respect to a molecular cloud, like a cloud of different odorants. And what people were doing here was precisely just perceiving it back in their memories. They know Parmesan, they know vomit. And actually, if you now sniff Parmesan, you will have a vomity odor to it. So I'm sorry, I just ruined pasta for you.
Yes, yeah.
But it shows you just how accurate the nose actually is. And if people say, well, how can it be that they thought it's something different? Well, this is the key about smell and why it's so different from vision. Because you don't just have a molecule with one smell, you have a molecule which has kind of a bouquet of different qualities to it. You have more than one. An odor is a multitude of qualities. It's really like Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes. So if you see colors, you've got, like, you see the blue, you don't see red. You see the blue, you don't see green. But with most odorants, with most molecules, if you smell them, you have more than one note or quality to it. And that's why, for instance, you can never, like, it's lots of information your brain is processing. It focuses, it owns in on certain parts that are then connected if you've got another cue, such as a verbal cue or a visual cue, combine it into a mental image. And so if one of my favorite molecules is cis-3-hexanol, which is fresh cut green grass, but it has also something leafy, something earthy in there. And so depending in what combination you experience that molecule, you will have a prominence of one note over the other. So this is the most important part about smell. It's not an illusion. It's not that you're being fooled. It's not that you're being subjective or misled. It's how the system is tuned to accommodate the fact that you've got a promiscuous stimulus. You've got certain molecules in different contexts, and you're not always even consciously perceiving that. So my favorite example, I'm sorry, I'm now ruining coffee for you. My favorite example is coffee, because it's not one molecule, it's 800 molecules. It's a variety of different things coming together. Now, 3% of coffee is indole, and indole literally smells of shit. It has a very strong fecal smell. And you don't perceive, but of course, the shade in the coffee, because it's the sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of its parts, so to speak. Unless you're, for instance, a pregnant woman, then you're tuned to certain, like, sensitive to certain contaminants. And many pregnant women actually smell the indole in the coffee. And even you, even though you're not consciously aware of the indole in the coffee, you might be able to do it through forced choice tests. That what would you prefer, or are these things different? There was a study with jasmine, actually. Jasmine odor also several hundreds of molecules, 3% indole, so jasmine is very shitty. And people were asked, like, they had a synthetic version without the shit, and they had the real version with the proper shit. They were asked, well, are they the same? Are they not? And they could distinguish them, and they preferred the shitty version, by the way. So Freud would have a field day here.
Okay, I feel like there's a lot of points coming out there. So I feel like, but perhaps the sort of central idea was that each odorant has a whole series of sort of resonances in the smell. There's layers to the experience of the smell. And were you using that to suggest why, in certain contexts, we notice different elements, or yes, is that right? It kind of registers in a different way.
I like that a lot. The kind of resonance image. It's like music. You can just focus on the voice, or you can focus on the different layers of the instruments. So if a smell is really like a music piece, where you've got different parts coming together. So you have, of course, a holistic impression of it, but you can break it down and focus on different parts. And if you focus more on the music and the lyrics to a song, for instance, in a specific music piece, you will pay less attention to, let's say, there's a specific piano twist to it, or you can focus your attention on the piano twist. So there's much more going on here. Yeah.
And with the example with pregnant women being more sensitive to, is it indole?
Yeah. Yeah, I have to bring this up because it's one of my favorite
Yeah.
stories. Is that there's this perfume, Eternity by Calvin Klein.
Right. Yes.
It has lots of indole in it, so Eternity literally smells of shit.
Well, I hope they don't sue you, but that's.
Oh well, no, I actually like that
I
perfume.
don't
I
think they will.
actually like that perfume.
Well, we all like coffee, most of us. So I guess we all like shit a little bit. But I wanted to just explore this idea that depending on your state, so like pregnant women over are particularly sensitive to this particular smell, presumably because there's some evolutionary imperative, or because it's somehow more important, or their sort of biochemical state is different. So there's some function to that, is there?
Yeah, so with pregnant women, of course, you've got hormonal changes that affects also to what extent you are sensitive to certain smells, and it makes sense because, of course, they will be much more sensitive towards certain contaminants that could be potentially then in larger amounts harmful to the unborn baby. So definitely, there are these kind of aspects. Also, you will notice, for instance, that you are more or less sensitive to certain smells depending on your own state of being so. If you are hungover, certain smells just they make you they really are just too much, and certain smells really attract you because you're hungover, you're really hungry, you want something fatty. Best way to counter it is with an English breakfast, which I still think is like one of the best kind of countermeasures. While other smells, you get sick even smelling them, especially the thing that made you sick. So if you had a hangover after having too much of a specific kind of whiskey, and you smell that whiskey too, like afterwards, too shortly, again, you actually don't find it as appealing as you did when you got hungover.
Yes, of course, yeah. Well, okay, so we've got this one key kind of, I guess, philosophical part of the argument, which is that just because smells can be registered very differently depending on context, because even though they're very variably experienced, that's not to say they're sort of totally unreliable and merely subjective, right? So that's a sort of key point that you want to make in the book, isn't it?
Precisely. So the most important thing is really that the reliability is precisely that your nose is so fine-tuned that it picks up information, your brain evaluates and measures that information depending on the context. It's much harder to fool your nose because it is so reliant on both your physiological state and your perspective that you are literally picking up what's in front of you right now and not what has been constructed from a more abstract point. So this is where I recently was lucky to get out that Eon piece, why it's harder to fool your nose than your eyes, where we think vision is very objective and hard to fool, but actually it's the opposite because it's perspective invariant. So you can really, really target this as a weakness of the visual system by presenting a stimulus that could be constructed in both ways, because your visual system without motion, for instance, can't make a depth evaluation. So this is like the Ames room is a good example. While with smell, well, you are really, I mean, these are the molecules that are hitting your nose. There's nothing in between. There's no ambiguity here. So it's the point of smell is that it will really respond to what's in front of you right now in this context. So it is the most reliable way to evaluate information.
Yeah, and in case listeners don't know what the Ames room is, the Ames room, if I remember correctly, it's a visual illusion where a person stands in a room and it looks like they're enormous, but actually the room is constructed in sort of weird perspective. So it's a trick, basically. Yeah. It's a trick of perspective. Have I described that well?
Precisely. And you've got two. It's really cool. There's a video even where you've got two people in the room. And one looks like a very, very tiny, small person, and they're like this giant. And then they're switching positions because they're actually just on the same plane, and they're changing sizes. So the small person becomes this giant, and vice versa. And I think it's a beautiful example to illustrate that point.
So what you're saying is that kind of illusion is just not possible with smell.
There is no perspective invariant coding, none whatsoever. Because if I with vision is if I walk around the table, if I walk around the desk, no matter from what perspective I'm approaching it, it's a desk. It won't suddenly turn into a ball. If I spritz an odor at you and I tell you, for instance, well, that's parmesan or that's vomit, you will have a different mental image. So smell is not perspective invariant. It depends really on the context, on the surroundings, on other cues, what mental image you have. And the most important point is that the mental image is not the smell. So we often just like to, especially in philosophy, find a way to link our mental images to the physical world, as if these images are the thing. No, with smell, it's really you have information, you can get different mental images out of it. We need to get away from the fact that the image in the end is the real thing. No, it is the interpretation of sensory signals telling you what that thing is. But it's not that we shouldn't so to speak, take the description or take the word for the actual thing. And a good example is when you hear wine tasters, for instance, and they go like, there's petrol in there. I smell some petrol. So you sometimes hear that, especially with Riesling. Petrol is, and you think like, for heaven's sake, it's wine. I mean, how can they say there's petrol in there? Well, there is a molecule that smells of petrol, which they detect in there, which is the quality of certain qualitative marker for certain Riesling wines. So you just have to train yourself to detect that, but they're not literally saying there's petrol in the wine. They're saying there's a molecule which is also known from petrol, which smells of petrol, that is also part of this wine. Or you also sometimes have wine tasters say, oh, it smells of cat pee. Well, they're not saying that the cat peed into the wine or that. No, it's just there's specific components that are qualitative demarcation from other wines. So we shouldn't take the words and the images of these words to denote the real thing or some kind of object category. No, it's just a cognitive handle.
I think we're now fringing on what is a really key point that you were exploring in the book, which is this question of representation, right? And you're talking about the molecules and the sensory experience we have, and this relationship between them. Is this the point where we should talk about how theories of perception tend to be based on vision, and they tend to be about the relationship between the object and the thing as a kind of direct correspondence kind of thing, and how smell is different? Is this the point?
Indeed. That's actually a much simpler way to put it. I wish I would have written it like that in the book, but this was something that was driving me mental. This whole idea that you've got this mental image and you find a way to find a correspondence relation to the stimulus. Now, what's missing there? Like the object that it is represented by it, and what's missing here is the whole in-between sensory system. So many philosophers like to avoid any biology, any neuroscience, any kind of details about the sensory pathway as, oh, that's just, the plumbing that gets us there. But we can exclude that. This is just what the top scientists do. They fill out the details. And I thought that was wrong, especially with smell, because the big thing is, as I mentioned a couple of examples with the fact that you can have the same molecule giving you completely different pictures. None of that is an illusion or any form of hallucination or misguided representation, none whatsoever. That's not what smell evolved to do, and it's different. And to explain why it's different is you have to look at the so-called plumbing of the system, because you're not perceiving chemicals. It's not that we're perceiving chemistry as a chemist would. We are evolved like there's a biology that perceives the chemistry, and that explains why, for instance, you can't just make these generalized claims without an understanding of the biology. And I got frustrated with the idea that we just have to model the physical world and find some kind of correspondence to our mental world without even understanding how does that mental world actually come to be. What is it actually trying to what is even trying to be a representational issue here? So to what extent is it behaviorally relevant? Maybe smell really evolved to do something different, and mental imagery in smell is very, very important, but not in the same pathway, the same construction, and with the same function as vision. It's not there to be perspective invariant. It's not there to be always the same. And you can explain why that's not just a whim if you look at the plumbing of the system.
There's a really interesting story that you tell about the neural coding and the system of neural coding for smell, and how it's so different than the visual system. So we understand fairly well how to map the input from the retina in the eye through the visual system, and it retains certain structure that maps onto the visual scene in the way that neurons are firing in certain patterns. They're responsive to certain areas of the retina and certain features of the visual world. So we can map that stuff. How does the story unfold with smell?
That's what many people were kind of stuck with for a while, because people thought for a long time that smells should be represented in a similar enough way. So with vision, this is actually the beauty of the visual system. This is why it actually became so crucial for neuroscience. Is that you can really map the stimulus. You can really see how the stimulus is detected at the retina and then projected through the thalamus to the primary visual cortex. It looks like a map. It looks beautiful, and that principle was found also in the motor system, the somatosensory system, the auditory system, and then smell came along. And people first thought, well, we've got the receptors in the 1990s and 1991. There was a pattern in the bulb as well. So the first the first step in the brain, and people thought, oh, now we just have to find that map in the cortex. I couldn't find it. And I couldn't find it again. And it's one of the few cases where you have negative results being published, twice actually, where people realized we are not getting there. What you saw is that the signal was fanning out, so it was projecting everywhere. There was no order. It was really this weird mosaic. There was just pure chaos. People didn't know what to make of that. Well, hang on a second, what's going on there? So what's happening here is really that it's not so much for where do you locate the signal. So where do you locate a specific receptor signal to go in this area or that area? It was much more, where does it connect to? So the olfactory cortex is one of the most highly interconnected cortices. So it connects to the orbitofrontal cortex, which is there for decision making. Then you've got it connected to the amygdala, where you've got more kind of valence coming in. Then you've got it connected also to other areas involved in cross-modal perception. So this is why the same smell, you've got the signals in all sorts of directions going on, and you can really imagine it's like an auto-associative system. Whatever's going on in parallel with olfaction will take up the signal to make use of it in that context. It's much more like a measurement instrument of context, of relevance, of behavioral output than of mapping the input. It's really the other way around. Instead of just representing the input, it's much more how to respond to it. And the nice thing is that as I mentioned, they tried to find this input map. It's not there. And then a couple of years ago in 2014, actually the laboratory where I later would study for a while, would be a postdoc for a while, they found an output map, meaning neural populations being like projecting back into the cortex, where it's much more about what the signal is for, rather than what the signal coming in is, that will determine what is being processed. And that was one of the things I found very interesting, because we hear this often. You've got many people saying we should look at the brain more as relevant for behavior. But we still model it too often in neuroscience and also in philosophy as something that just represents the input. But that's not the point. The brain evolved to help the body to move, to do something. And smell is a good system to study. What does that mean? How is the signal then actually brought in, like when it's brought in, interpreted, and also represented, if it's actually there to do something rather than just like having a physical representation of the world?
Is this where the predictive brain story, does this come in here?
So I was amazed that there has been not more studies on smell as an incredibly good model system for predictive coding. I mean, predictive coding has been, you could really say, the new hot fashion recently in cognitive science, neuroscience, philosophy. Everybody jumps on it, and they're mainly using vision and, of course, audition. But smell is a great system because so what's happening here, just as an explanation, you've got two mechanisms going on in parallel, two abstracted mechanisms. You've got the stimulus input, and you've got the top-down processing. So what is happening here is that in a kind of an anthropomorphizing way, the brain learns the regularity in stimulus input and categorizes it as a certain schema, and that constant input still corrects that kind of schema. But the key message of that whole idea is really that you are not perceiving abstract images. So you're having a process that's constantly being updated. Whatever you're perceiving right now is a consequence of what you're having perceived before. We don't just see a person, we see a person coming into the room. So we're not just suddenly surprised by something. And smell is a wonderful example for studying that, because depending on in which context you encounter a smell, you will have it updated information. It depends on to what extent you learn certain things. So smell is a great model system to see how do we actually form prediction, how do we form schemas. So if you think of especially why do we, for instance, are so let's say have so many varieties when we try to describe smells as certain kind of concepts or ideas. Well, because we learn smells as mere associations. So the only things we seem to be agreeing on, if we're untrained noses, are food smells. Because these are the things where we really learn how to identify things and update that information. While with new smells or with smells we just occasionally encounter, we don't pin a concept to it. It's much more as that at some point you've got a stimulus being tagged with a certain behavioral relevance, and the organism then recognizes that stimulus in relation to that behavioral encounter. So you can have the same stimulus, say carrots, some kind of carrot smell, and you can have that carrot smell either independent, just the carrot smell, or the carrot smell and another stimulus, something, whether it's a tone or whether it's some kind of behavioral command or whatever. It will have different neural representations for the isolated stimulus and the stimulus with a specific behavioral meaning. So this is why this whole we are just representing the physical stimulus in the brain is not the right approach. It's always information in context.
There was a sentence in your book: perception does not mirror the world, it interprets it.
That is the better summary of what I just said. Yes, it's good to know that sometimes I actually say something smart. Yes.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're coming to the end now. I want to try and see if we can gather the big conceptual ideas that you've introduced so far and just sort of put them all together, just so we understand. So what are the big conceptual changes that you think we need to make in how we think about perception from these things?
So the key message seems very, very simple, actually. It is really to actually, first of all, question our intuition. Because quite often we approach and we try to interpret both empirical observations as also on the other hand, our theoretical understanding through concepts that are historically grown. And perception is one of the most, you could say, historically laden topics. And a lot of the ideas about perception and how we try to study perception, even now in science, is still pre-scientific. Lots of the concepts and looking at smell and also actually at interoception, proprioception, all these things is a good way to question this intuition and to see to what extent are these concepts really describing the phenomena we're trying to understand, or to what extent are they just intellectual baggage from older ideas that might actually need some updating. So when we describe perception, we often think of objects of perception, perceptual objects. We've got this kind of spatial idea very, very strongly. So the question is that really translatable to smell, for instance? What parts are translatable? What parts need to be changed? And to what extent can we then also update our understanding of vision? Because a lot of ideas in vision are now also in flux, actually. And examples such as the dress, for instance, all these kind of really, really cool illusions that are, especially on like social media, making the rounds. I don't think illusions are if the system goes wrong. I think illusions is precisely how the system works, and it helps us to update why is it, for instance, that these things can be posed in a certain way, which ironically, it's a very old idea. Helmholtz said that already, so this is why I like this guy. He already said, like, we gotta understand how illusions work, then we know how the system works and what perception is. And in that same way, I think smell is a good way to do that. So the message of the book is really, we gotta rethink perception, we gotta rethink how we interpret both our theories of perception as well as the neuroscience as well. Neuroscience helps us to update philosophical theories, but also is often itself too strongly embedded in a certain philosophical heritage. That also, this is where philosophers, for instance, can contribute to neuroscience. So neuroscience has to inform philosophy, but philosophy also has to be self-critical enough to help neuroscience.
Wonderful. Well, there's a thought to end on. And actually, I just wanted to throw in this quote that a statement you make at the end of the book, which I think is very exciting and ties in with what you've just said. So you sort of end with this rallying cry that this approach offers a chance to slingshot naturalist philosophy into the 21st century and break down the silos of institutionalized disciplinarity that are neatly dividing philosophical from neuroscientific inquiry. Which sounds pretty exciting to me. So thank you, Dr. Barwich, for your time, and best of luck in your grand mission.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This was fun.